Thank you for attending today's researcher talk. I'm Richard McCulley, historian at the Center for Legislative Archives, which sponsors this series. We have a researcher talk scheduled each month through July, with the exception of April, which tends to be a heavy professional conference month. So we should be anticipating presentations on some very interesting research that's been conducted in the records of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and also learning about some of the really outstanding books recently published and those in progress that the center staff and holdings have supported. Our guest today is Rebecca Edwards, professor of history in the Eloise Ellery Chair and also chair of the history department at Vassar College. She launches this year's series with a presentation provocatively titled Sex on the Frontier, Fertility in America's Antebellum Empire. It's part of a book project tentatively titled Multiplied U.S. Politics, Conquest, and Women's Reproductive Labor, 1803 to 1917. We are truly honored to have Professor Edwards as a guest today. She is one of those historians who has breathed life into political history by studying the intersection between politics and gender. She made a big splash with her very creative and innovative book about post-Civil War politics, Angels and the Machinery, Gender in American Party Politics from the Civil War to the Progressive Era, published by Oxford University Press in 1997. She is also the author of New Spirits, Americans in the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1905, published in 2010, also by Oxford University Press. She is also co-author with James Henretta and Robert Self of America's History, now in its 7th edition. We should have time for Q&A after the presentation. If you have a question, please raise your hand so we can pass the mic to you. And thank you very much, Rebecca, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for having me here today. It's a big pleasure, and I get to talk about what I found at the National Archives last time I was here, which is, I had to apologize at the beginning because I have the world's most boring PowerPoint presentation today. I just don't have very many visuals for this project yet. I have one very grainy black and white image, and in addition to a few pictures of this petition, which is going to be hard to read where you are, but it's evidence that it's actually there upstairs, right? And also evidence that I now know how to use a document camera, which is very new for me. So I want to talk about this petition a little bit, and I definitely want to leave lots of time for questions and answers and having a good conversation afterwards. And thank you again for being here. In January 1840, a married couple from Attala County, Mississippi, sent an unusual petition to Congress, which one of their senators actually presented 3 months later on the Senate floor. John and Nancy Scarborough wrote that, quote, the fruits of their union so far had provided, quote, 20 living children to the Republic. 17 of their children were actually living. I think they meant by 20 living children, 20 who were born alive. 17 remained living. And the Scarboroughs reported that their neighbors had, and people that they knew had urged them to remove from the United States to the new independent Texas Republic next door, not too far from Mississippi, which was just 4 years old, had just been recognized by the U.S. in 1837. And they noted that in Texas, quote, each of their offspring would be entitled to receive a donation of land, amounting, it is said, almost to a township in the aggregate. And they found this a very tempting offer. The family described themselves as, quote, poor but industrious people. I don't know that anyone has ever petitioned the federal government without saying that they were poor and industrious. Certainly they said so. And they said that while they loved their country with a deep devotion, they did not have, quote, the means to provide homes for so large a number of citizens as they are rearing up for it. But your memorialists, they added, hoped to avoid moving to Texas. They desired, quote, to live and retain their children within this great and glorious republic, their 13 sons as good citizens and defenders of the nation which gave them birth, and their daughters as mothers of a future race of good citizens. The Scarboroughs therefore prayed the federal government for a quarter section of land for each of their 17 living children, just as they would get in Texas, making in all 4 sections and 1 quarter. And for those of us who are not so versed in land policy, that was 800 acres, or by my calculation, that's about 1 1/8 square mile of land, if you count all one quarter section for each child. And if the government didn't mind, the Scarboroughs humbly suggested that there were some very fine locations in Newton and Neshoba counties, which had just been taken from the Choctaw Native people, and they suggested that that'd be a lovely place to get their quarter sections of land. They concluded, quote, that the man and wife who rears up 13 sons and 4 daughters for the Republic surely has claims on their country. And they appended the signatures of 24 Atala County men who supported the petition. And the Scarboroughs said that they had no doubt their application will meet with the approbation of the whole American people. Well, so I want to use this petition to explore a couple of things that I think we need to think about more as historians in the history of the frontier and in the history of American expansion and empire and the politics of empire. First of all, I have to tell you the end of the story. They did not get a grain of land. There are a bunch of people who wrote to the federal government with similar pleas, many of whom I think were much more in need than the Scarboroughs, and none of them got any land. They all got sent to all these bills, even if they're congressmen, and I suspect there were many more that the congressmen didn't bring to the floor, but those that came to the floor died in committee somewhere. And second of all, not having been rejected, having their petition rejected, they did not move to Texas. At least so far as I can tell, they certainly didn't move to Texas. None of their children that I can find moved to Texas anytime before the Civil War. But I think it's important, not because they failed to win their grant of land, but there are 2 big themes here that I'm exploring in this project that I'm working on. First of all, the Scarboroughs were not as unusual as you might think. Antebellum frontier fertility, particularly on the southern frontier, was staggeringly high. 20 children was a large number, I agree, although I found other families with 23, 24, 25, sometimes by 1 wife, sometimes more often by 2, 3 wives in succession. I think my record so far is 27, but that's by 1 woman. I found other families in which the husband had as many as 6 wives successively and had as many as 30-some children over a long period of time with several wives. Among the Scarboroughs' immediate neighbors in Atala County, Hosea and Pauline Crowder had 15 children. Reuben and Nancy Dotson had 14. James and Louisa Fletcher also had 14. William Nash's Mary died after the birth of their 11th child. Samuel Merv had 12 by his first wife after her death following childbirth. He had 4 more by a second wife. And there are many, many other families with 9, 10, 11. And Atala County, it wasn't that there was something in the water in Atala County. This is just how things were in Missouri, in southern Indiana, in Illinois, and Oregon, and Mississippi, Alabama, all over the southern frontier and parts of also the Northwest and Oregon too, which is interesting. We aren't familiar with this story because we tell a story of the demographic transition beginning in this period. And what I want to argue is that does happen, but it happens in the Northeast. It happens in New England, to a little bit lesser extent in Pennsylvania and New York, and we haven't really seriously grappled with what's going on in the other part of the country, where fertility is actually higher than it was in colonial New England. What I think we're seeing in the antebellum frontier is not a continuation of some kind of older traditional pattern, but something new. And we can talk more about that in the question and answer period if you'd like. But clearly, America's westward expansion rested on women's reproductive labor, because all these children, with very high survival rates among these children, go on to populate North America. Which is what people say at the time in a very celebratory way. Wow, look what we did. Now, was it free labor? That's a really interesting question. I think for white women, the answer is sort of. Women certainly had a free choice of whom to marry, but one of the things that's interesting to me about the frontier is how young women were when they married. And the reason why frontier fertility was higher than in colonial New England was primarily due to younger marriage ages. The average marriage age in colonial New England was around 21 or 22. I'm having trouble. I'm still working on my genealogical tables and data and everything to find kind of averages on the frontier. But marriages of 16 were very common. Women who were 15, 14 were not infrequent. I have memoirs of women who remember that as soon as they reached legal majority under the common law, which was 12, that they began receiving proposals of marriage and being pressured by suitors to marry, I think partly because women were scarce on the frontier, because households had to have both a man and a woman to operate. But getting married at age 14, that's striking. It's an unusual pattern. There are other forms of labor that are sort of hidden in the Scarborough Petition that I want to talk about now that were most definitely unfree, and that is the reproductive labor of enslaved African American women. And their reproductive labor also contributed to expansion. One of the 26 Atala men who signed in support of the Scarboroughs, one of the men who's on this petition, we can go on and look at the list of the people who signed in support of this petition, was a man named Magnus Teague, who had eloped at age 17 with the 16-year-old daughter of a prominent Alabama planter, and they had moved out to Mississippi and had 9 children. But perhaps of even greater importance to Magnus Teague's wealth and status in Mississippi was that, quote, his first slave woman bore 24 children. Very high levels of fertility among enslaved African American women are a part of this story that I also want to grapple with. And I just want to say that, that the Scarboroughs in their petition about their sort of poor, industrious need for land didn't say very much about the fact that they owned slaves. In fact, they didn't say anything, but some of their neighbors very helpfully added to this petition. One of them wrote and said, you should really give them this giant grant of land because they only have 6 working Negroes. Well, they actually owned 11 slaves. 6 of them were young children, which again sort of proves this point that another form of reproductive labor was also increasing their security and prosperity on the frontier. And quite a few of their children went on to become small-scale slaveholders. This is not a family that becomes wealthy and prominent. So we have astronomically high frontier fertility. And then I also want to talk a little bit about how this, I'll save a little bit more for the question and answer period, but I want us to see this as something that's just not sort of natural and traditional, but something that's politically and legally constructed, and to explore it as something that's new and different in that location. To really make the case I want to make, which is that frontier, particularly southern frontier fertility in the antebellum period, was as high as almost any time and place in world history that we have data for. We would have to go on a big global tour, which we can do in the question and answer period. But that's the claim that I want to make, is that we don't have very many data on very many places where fertility anywhere at any time was this high. And what I want to do, though, is talk about the kind of political meanings now of this fertility. The Scarborough's petition was introduced by their senator, one of their 2 Mississippi senators, who was Robert J. Walker. And those of you who are interested in the Democratic Party, the filibusters, Texas, all Jacksonian democracy, all those sorts of things, a sectional crisis, will immediately know that Robert J. Walker was sort of Texas's shadow representative when Texas was an independent republic and had applied to become part of the United States but had not been. It was an independent republic. And when Texas wanted its interests raised or discussed in Congress, they could call on Walker, who would say, well, I think the Texans would say, da, 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 da. So he was representing Mississippi, but I think it's not at all an accident that the Scarborough's petition was introduced by him. In fact, I think it's quite likely that Walker himself cooked up the petition in consultation with them and with other Democrats from Mississippi. He wanted to sort of push this idea that the United States needed to do more in continental expansion. Otherwise, these big families might threaten to go across to Mexico. They never did. I don't think they were going to. It was sort of a rhetorical point that he wanted to make. And there is a fair amount of conversation and political discourse, of course, about reproduction. One of the things I'm wrestling with is that, of course, women's reproductive labor was private. It was done within the home. When people talk about expansion and conquest and the frontier on the floor of Congress, you don't expect them to speak very much about women's reproductive labor. You expect them to sort of take it for granted. But in fact, they have a lot to say. And I've got a lot of the Congressional Globe ahead of me, so I can't definitively say I've found all the references yet. But I'm fascinated by how often politicians, Democratic politicians, expansionists, do talk about reproduction in some form or other. The Illinois politician Stephen Douglas, his favorite metaphor was bees. He says, well, bees swarm and we swarm, and we need new land in the West because the hive is going to break off, right? And there's this persistent metaphor of people being insects and bees, which I find really fascinating. I wouldn't think that you would stand up on the floor of Congress and compare people to swarms of bees, but this is a kind of a constant metaphor, and it reminds me of some. I believe it was Red Cloud who came east and came back and reported. He said the white people are like ants. There are so many of them, and you could step on some, but there's going to be more, right? So this whole metaphor of insects is kind of something I'm trying to figure out how that works. But sometimes it was even more explicit. There in the debate over Oregon, there was an Indiana congressman named Andrew Kennedy who stood up on the floor of the House, and he said, we have to have Oregon. We will have Oregon. It's inevitable that we'll get Oregon, and we must have it. And the reason why is the American multiplication table. And he said, here's how the American multiplication table works. Go out to my district, and you will find a sturdy man in a log cabin and a wife beside him. And you come back in 30 years, and where there was 2, there will be 22. For some reason, there was this kind of obsession with the round number of 20 children, right? And he says, that's the American multiplication table. That's why we're going to have Oregon. There are some European commentators who say more or less the same thing. Lord Castlereagh, the British diplomat, said at one point, America has already won Oregon in its bedchambers. So there are a lot of different people commenting on the role that reproduction plays. And the American newspapers love this little thing about the American multiplication table. And you can go back and you can find, after he gives this speech on the floor of Congress, and you can see everybody sort of laughing. It's like in the Globe, they'll say, laughter, ha, 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 right, everything. But the newspapers pick it up, and they'll say, we hear that Mrs. O'Reilly just gave birth to her 18th child, and that's the American multiplication table at work, or a German immigrant family just came through with their 13 kids, and there's the American multiplication table. They're headed for Wisconsin. So you can see that this is not just one speech, but something that's popularly picked up in the press. The other interesting thing, I think, is that the Scarborough's petition illuminates is that as the U.S. continental ambitions accelerated in the 1830s and 1840s, there is a reversion to this idea, earlier colonial idea of head right, the idea that a large family should get a larger piece of land, and that you shouldn't just get a piece of land per household, but that children might also receive land. And this shows up in the Scarborough petition. It shows up again in the debates over Oregon. The original bill for Oregon, annexation of Oregon, that was introduced by Missouri Senator Lewis Lynn in 1843 had in it a provision for 160 acres for a man, 160 acres additional to a man who was married, and 160 acres for each child under age 18, including any children born in the first 5 years in Oregon. This bill did not pass, but that was the original form it took, and there was a lot of conversation about it. I found a great quote from an Ohio paper said, good Lord, there are families in Ohio that could just establish a principality on that bill, right? But it was clearly about this idea of head right. And the Spanish, until very late, offered land not per household, but per child and also per indentured servant, apprentice, or slave. Any per member of a household. Of course, it goes to the household head. But they offered that, and the U.S. Politicians are talking about that this is what we need to do. We got a lot of land to fill up. We really want it filled up fast, and we should encourage people to go out there and have children. And what ultimately happened in Oregon was that the bill did offer additional land to married men, so 160 acres to a husband, to a single man. And 320 acres to a married man. And this seems to have perhaps accelerated early marriage even more. At least contemporary commentators said that it did. And I have accounts that I'm trying to track down now. I have them from sources in the late 19th century, but I haven't gotten people didn't do their footnotes right, so I can't find the original sources yet, but I'm looking. Apparently there were people who came to Oregon in the early years and reported married women in Oregon who they found at age 12, 13, and 14 playing with their dolls, that they were married at very, very young ages and took their dolls with them to their husband's house. That pretty much sums it up right there, right? So clearly, this issue of early marriage and populating the country with maximum reproduction is a piece of the story of Manifest Destiny. I'll just touch very, very briefly on this because this is something I'm just beginning to think about now. But the birth of children is also a form of racial claiming. And everywhere all over the continent, first white children, the birth of a first white child is recorded. And I was over actually at the DAR library looking at lots and lots of county histories, and I'm fascinated how I always knew, I think, and some, we think of Virginia Dare as the first white child born in the New World, and I figured that different states had, a first white child who was born in Iowa or Indiana. No, every county has a first white child, and in some cases, every township within a county has a first white child, the name, the date, the parents recorded, and in some places, the birth of the first white male child was so important that if the first white child born was a girl, they would also then record the second, so they could record also the birth of the first white male child. And clearly, that's an essential starting point, right, for claiming geographic space. And I can't find, I've got a couple of really sharp, I know Jesse, who's here today, who's a Vassar graduate and who's a graduate student who may know people who are writing about this, but I can't find anybody who's written about the ways in which the birth of white children becomes a kind of overt form of racial claiming on the frontier. I also want to write about the ways in which women's reproductive labor and children, the bodies of young children, become weapons in wars between whites and native peoples. And I have, the closer I get to this topic, the more I keep putting it off because it's really horrific stuff. The ways in which the killing of pregnant women and at best the kidnapping and adoption of children, but often the killing of children is central to a lot of these conflicts. I will just give you this one very grainy picture, the only image that I have today. But this is the kind of source where you can't believe it exists until you actually find it. And I have to explain what it is. So in the Minnesota-Dakota War of the 1860s, there is a militiaman who was seeking revenge on the Dakota after the uprising. And he supposedly quoted General William S. Harney, who was a veteran of the Indian Wars in the West, in which they talked about what kind of revenge should be taken on the Dakota and whether Indian children should be spared, whether Dakota children should be spared. And this man said, no, you have to kill the children because nits make lice. That quote has been attributed to Chivington and the Sand Creek Massacre for a long time. It doesn't start there. I'm trying to figure out how far back it goes. But certainly it's used, deployed in the Dakota War in the 1860s. And there's a very interesting article by someone who finds that the first use that she can find of this idea that you should exterminate children is actually used by one of Cromwell's lieutenants in Ireland. So it goes way back, and I have a hunch that this is something that's a kind of frontier saying that nobody writes down very much, but that it's out there. I just have to go and try to hunt for it. But in any case, there's a kind of jarring juxtaposition between that kind of horrific statement on the deliberate killing of Native children and this, which I have to explain, is one of the last panels, the very last panel, I think, in a cyclorama of the Dakota conflict that toured around the Midwest after the Dakota conflict in Minnesota, but also in neighboring states. And it was, I have to go to this is at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I have to go and see it. If I understand it correctly, it's painted on sort of a translucent sheet type, and to have light projected behind it. I'm not exactly sure what form. It's sort of in the mode of magic lantern shows and things of that sort, right? But I'm not exactly sure what format this takes. But the very last image, after a narration of the Dakota conflict, a narration of the driving out of the Dakota from Minnesota, a narration of whites, securing peace for themselves in Minnesota. This is the very last image, and it's called Minnesota Fruit. And it's I've got a close-up here so that you can kind of see it, but there's a third woman actually over on this side. But it's these three women who are standing under a tree. And the one on the left is shaking the tree, and the one on the right is holding out. They're very nicely dressed, like they're wearing sort of party dresses, right? This would be from the late 1860s, early 1870s. The other one's holding out her skirt. And can you see what's in the tree? Babies. The tree is full of babies. And they're shaking white babies out of the tree into their laps. A very sort of chaste, you could use this to teach 5-year-olds where babies come from, right? Well, you just go out and you shake trees and they come down, right? It's a very chaste image, but also an image of fertility and a clear sense that the benefit, the result of the driving out of the Dakota from Minnesota and the success of white conquest is the arrival of a tree full of babies, right? That fertility is the result. Okay, so just a few comments here at the end on maybe what all this means. I don't really know quite what all this means yet. I'm in the middle of the project, and so you can help me, I hope, figure out what it all means. I think we can say that antebellum Jacksonian democracy was patriarchal. We may have already said that before, but I want to try to understand in new ways what that meant. I want to go a step further, and I want to suggest that Jacksonian democracy, capital D democracy, was in essence based on what I would call a reproductive regime, based on intensive use of reproductive labor of both free and enslaved women to claim the continent. And that we can think about slavery, we can think about white women's reproductive labor in the home, we can think about the deployment of reproductive labor in scenes like these, and the claiming of the continent. And we can take the patriarchal household as a kind of political base. The United States never had overtly pro-natal policies in the way that a country like France did, where they actually gave you tax breaks or encouraged in various ways childbearing. In fact, the Jacksonian capital D Democrats were not people who wanted to use the state for many things, right? They believed in a private, the private patriarch of the male household was the citizen, was the political touchstone, right? The cornerstone of the republic. So this is not a policy that's undertaken in a deliberate sort of way, right? It's a hybrid public-private project. And that's one of the things I'm trying to understand that's hardest to figure out, right? It'd be much easier if someone in Washington said, yes, we should give every family X in order to encourage them to have more children and fill up the continent more quickly. They sort of say that, right? Something like the Scarborough's petition, which Walker is introducing, is clearly hinting at that, right? But then the federal government is never actually interested in giving the Scarboroughs land. If they really wanted a pronatal policy, they would have handed over 1.8 square miles of Mississippi and said, here, everybody have 20 kids and we'll give you each a square mile of land. They did not do that. And so this public-private hybrid of how this works politically, I think, is something to think about. I want, even further down the line, I want to think about how, with the arrival of industrialization, urbanization, and the ascendancy of the Republican Party, you get a very different regime. What I'm thinking of as an intensive regime rather than a reproductive regime. And it's based on much more limited childbearing. It's what we're more familiar with as the demographic transition. It begins in New England after the American Revolution, but gains steam and becomes important nationwide. I think that it's important that the Republican Party in the 1850s was founded in the same year that the United States had its first Better Babies contest. Quality over quantity. There's an emphasis on fewer children, intensive nurturing and care, inculcating a conscience in the child, and a different view of marriage, right? And a different view of women's role within marriage, and clearly a very different view of slavery. All of those things are fit together. That profound shift from what I think of as a reproductive regime to what I think of as a post-Civil War intensive regime, that shift took place over the course of the 19th century in different places at different speeds in different ways. It was aided by technological changes, which we can also talk about if people would like to talk about contraceptives during the question and answer period, just to keep everybody awake. There was something called the Rubber Revolution in the late 19th century that made it a lot easier to have fewer children, although people were figuring out how to do that already. And my students at Vassar, at least, are always very fascinated in the how. Right? There was no birth control pill yet. So how is it that people just up and decided they wanted to have 2 or 3 kids instead of 20? And how did that exactly work? And we could talk more about that if you'd like. But my last point that I want to make is that what I would like to do, in addition to just paying close attention to the reproductive labor of women, which I think has been overlooked in the story of empire and nation building, but also to reorient the story of women's history in the United States in the 19th century, somewhat away from what I would call the suffrage story. And there are a lot of historians thinking about this now. If you haven't read, if you're interested in the history of women, you haven't read Lisa Tetro's new book, The Myth of Seneca Falls. It's a fabulous book. And she explores the ways in which the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony constructed a story in which voting rights was the centerpiece of women's rights in the 19th century. And she shows exactly how and when that story was constructed and retroactively applied backwards to Seneca Falls, where in fact I think the main emphasis was not on voting rights, but on coverture, right? And on the fact that married women were legally covered by their husbands and had no legal rights, but were in fact considered property of their husbands. And Seneca Falls was very much about overturning coverture. And there are whole aspects of the women's rights movement in the 19th century that I think get very much underemphasized if we put our major emphasis on suffrage, reproductive rights, emancipation, sex radicalism, what people in the 19th century called motherhood in freedom, freedom of choice over motherhood, and a range of other things that give more attention if we focus on reproduction as central to most women's lives. And a lot of other pieces of the story, from raising the age of consent. It occurred to people in the late 19th century that maybe 12 was not a great age at which to allow people to get married. And so raising the age of consent, enacting laws against marital rape, advocating voluntary motherhood, things of that sort. So I'm just going to end with a little provocative quote from Emma Goldman, who said, "Capitalism needs a large race." And there's clearly an economic component. I've emphasized politics here, but there's clearly a political economy of reproduction going on here. Nation states that are bent on expansion also need a large race. And so I want to explore in this project, or I've tried to suggest some of the ways now that women's reproductive labor contributed to the creation of that large race in the early 19th century United States, and that should be central both to our story of women's history and also to our story of politics. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to see what else you would like to talk about. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, and please tell me who you are, if you would.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chris Wilhelm. I work in the Center for Legislative Archives. I have two questions. One is, obviously it takes significant resources to support families of this size. How do these family sizes compare to the size of the Native American families who occupied the same space? And was there an awareness at the time in the East of the size of these families, and did the people in the East kind of go, oh my God, these people are crazy sex maniacs, or if my husband wants to take me to the West, I have to have 50 million children, or was this kind of known thing?
The second one's easier to answer, sure. People did not actually, we think about everything in terms of sex, and of course I put sex in the title of my talk because that keeps everybody awake on a dreary January day, but they thought about fecundity rather differently, but they did associate it with the frontier, and they associated it with land. So I have these hilarious quotations basically saying, Feliciana Parish in Louisiana, East Feliciana down the road, they're famous for their pumpkins and their squash, but we do kids, right? I mean, they very much think of it as, and they say, there's a phrase used at the time, California mothers. That is, if you go to California, I found a great quote from someone who says, women who have been as Rachels in the East go west and they become as Rebeccas. I haven't gone back to see how many kids Rebecca had in the Bible, but it was a lot. So the idea is that it's the place that causes fertility. I found a great quote from someone saying, look at this New England farmer. He's raised 8 sons and they're all 6'2", even though he's on this rocky hillside in New England where nothing is supposed to grow. So they really think of children like crops, right? They certainly think of enslaved children that way, right? As saleable crops. There's no question in my mind that they think about that. But they also, to a certain degree, in a different way, think of white children as a crop as well. And I'm trying to explore what that means and what it's, they don't have a sentimental view of childhood, right? It's the sentimental view of childhood comes along with the intensive regime later on and a different idea about parents and their relationship with children. The second question, the first question that you asked, is a very difficult one. Native American societies had very, very different reproductive practices, very different assumptions about the family, and generalizing about that is, first of all, dangerous, right? And it's something that I'm still trying to wrestle with. But I think that the whole sort of white trope of the vanishing Indian in the 19th century rests in part on white assumptions about white reproductive expansion, right? And a contrast between Native American families and white families. I think that's largely what whites wanted to see. I found a really, really interesting set of documents about the Shawnees saying that, the ideal in sort of Shawnee interviews with whites in the late 19th century, that the ideal for a Shawnee woman was to have 12 children. So I'm not at all persuaded that Native peoples had I have a incomplete information. I'm giving you an incoherent answer right now, right? I'm trying to think about this, but certainly there are differences in the same interviewer who said, yes, well, the ideal for Shawnee women is to have 12 children, said, I've never actually known one who had 12 children. Whereas clearly the Scarboroughs and about 7,000 other families had massively large numbers of kids. The question about subsistence is a really important one. Having 20 kids was good for the nation, and for a nation that wanted to expand. It wasn't necessarily good for the families. And there's all kinds of documentation of families who are in pretty desperate straits after having large numbers of children. that may be one reason why everybody decides later in the century not to do this anymore. What's good for, and we can, the end of my story really is about Theodore Roosevelt and race suicide. And Roosevelt going around and saying, every white woman in America really needs to have 4 children. You all need to have 4 children because the white race is disappearing, right? Well, families discovered that having 20 children was not necessarily economically viable or good for the children, right? Most of the advocates of birth control are saying, you know, families will do better if they have fewer kids. And so they need to know, we all have to learn about contraceptives, and we need to, you know, talk about that because it's really important for families to be able to manage the number of children they have. So I think that's a part of the conversation there. Yes?
What about women's health? 20 children?
Women's health is
What did,
terrible.
I have a friend. His father went through 3 women. They all died just to get his, you know, he didn't have 20 children, but nobody mentions the health of the woman in this. I'm interested in that.
That's right. It's a really interesting question. I have 1 kid. I don't want to make assumptions that a woman who has 12 children is necessarily unhappy with that choice. I don't want to sort of assume that families with 2 children are always better. However, the conditions of childbearing on the antebellum frontier were pretty horrible. And I'm spending this year finding testimony from women themselves. And there's not a whole lot of joy associated with being the parent of 20 kids in rapid succession. The health effects are severe, and you know, exhaustion and all kinds of physical ailments. I need to go look at the medical literature about what actually happens after that. But I mean, it's incredibly physically taxing to have 20 children, right? And you have a lot of women who die in childbirth. One of the best, I think, accounts, there was a woman named Margaret Haywood who went south in the 1930s and interviewed women. White women in the South, because during the New Deal, the federal government wanted to know why Southern women were having so many more children than in other parts of the country, because the pattern continues more in the South than elsewhere, although they're still not having the kinds of children that they're having in the antebellum period in numbers. And they interview women who say, when I find I'm pregnant, I just cry and cry and cry. I cry through the whole pregnancy. And I love every one of my children, and when they're born, I love them. But I sure do wish I could have fewer. Right? And there's some really interesting quotations from like a woman in New England who tells her husband, I would really like to have just 2 or 3. And he says, I think she had 10. And he says, well, if women got to make the decision, nobody would have very many kids now, would they? So, I mean, it's about power, right, within the family and who gets to decide. And there's absolutely no antebellum assumption that women get to decide, whether they have any control over their own bodies. They belong to their husbands. And so who makes these decisions? One of the most important forms of contraception that starts being used in the United States and in England and in France is coitus interruptus, withdrawal, which is women cannot do that by themselves, right? The guy has got to be in charge of withdrawal. And I think that middle-class men in America, have a major role in the demographic transition, right? And so the wives who are having 20 kids and the wives who are having 2 or 3 kids, their husbands' views about family size are absolutely, and we think of reproduction as women's work, but decisions about family size may have lain more in the hands of men than, I think they lay more in the hands of men than women. And yeah, that's a long and complicated answer, but I think the story's not very pretty. I explain to people when I'm researching and they go, ick. Why don't you study the women who are out there working for women's rights? And it's like, well, I mean, because it's a pretty horrific, and particularly when we talk about, you know, forcible slave breeding, and I mean, there's some really pretty horrific aspects of this topic. But I think that's what we ought to look at, because it's, you know, it was the real lived experience for tens of thousands of women. Yeah.
I'll get you to ask your question into the microphone, if you don't mind, please.
I'll pass it over.
Hi. So, what about outside the mainstream of marriage? In other words, I'm going to throw a bunch of things at you and you can pick and choose. One would just be out and out rape and illegitimate children. What about divorce? How do the children go then? how about infertile, either men or women? In other words, was that grounds for a divorce if your wife turned out to be infertile? Things like that. In other words, is there enough documentation to go into the aspects of sexuality that are not the mainstream marriage?
It's a really good question. I think so. Other historians have worked, I mean, I'm borrowing in this project also from work of other historians, and people have found a fair amount about this. One of the things that I'm interested in terms of sort of outside of marriage, is the very, very large number of white male slaveholders who essentially engaged in polygamy, who had a white wife whom they were legally married, and who had additional sexual partners who were enslaved, who were their property. Well, their wives were also sort of their property, but in a different way. It's epidemic. White male slaveholders, many white male slaveholders had multiple sexual partners, right? And some sold the offspring of those unions. Those ranged from forcible rape to various forms of coercion, right? To answer the questions about divorce, marriage relations were really kind of loose on the frontier. There's a book called Homestead's Ungovernable about Texas. Texas, so many people had abandoned a wife or a husband somewhere else and moved to Texas and remarried that Texas basically decriminalizes it in the 1850s. They're like, you know, half the state is bigamists, right? I mean, if we're going to prosecute everybody who has a wife left in Illinois, the Texas is going to go under. So they just kind of decriminalize it. And I think there are lots of people who do that. So those kinds of aspects of this, I mean, I'm really predominantly looking at marital fertility. Most people that I'm looking at white people were married. African Americans, enslaved African Americans, of course, were not legally married. So there's a whole bunch of different aspects of that. I don't know if that.
How about infertility?
So inability to perform sexually was grounds for divorce. Infertility was not in itself grounds for divorce. But it's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that much. I haven't found very many infertile people, to tell you the truth. But I know they were there, and it must be an issue, right? But I don't know. And that's a really good question that I need to think about more.
I don't know who it's by, and I've only just skimmed it, but it's about infertility in America. But it's like from, you know, the beginning to whenever.
Okay, so clearly I need to find that book and think about infertility.
One other thing, how did a family of 20 people house themselves? What did that look like?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and one of the reasons I think we haven't seen this is because they don't house themselves all together. I'm looking at a family in Indiana right now where I calculated that the youngest child, a daughter, was 6, and the oldest child was 44. So the Scarborough family, both parents in that family die, actually, not long after this petition, in 46 and 48. I think the husband dies first and then the wife. I think all the younger children, they still had a lot of kids at home, but they all scattered to the older children's households, right? The older brother. So in the census, if you go look for them in the census, you can never find that they had 20 kids, right? Because nobody ever has 20 kids at home at the same time. What's been great for me is that in 1900, actually in 1890, but that census burned tragically. But in 1900, they asked every woman who was married or widowed, how many children have you born? And how many are still living? And that's incredibly helpful data. Clearly, a lot of women who had begun childbearing in the 30s and 40s and 50s are still alive in 1900. It's not a perfect sample, but it's at least a fair number. And there you have the actual woman usually speaking directly to the census taker and saying, I had 22 children, right? Now, if she says 6 of those are alive, does that mean that many of them died in infancy? Does it mean that they died during the Civil War? Does that mean they so that information has been less helpful than I originally hoped, because you just don't know, except that I can say that African-American women, I've looked at a couple of the richest plantation counties in Alabama, and African-American women's fertility is unbelievably high under slavery, and death rates of the children are unbelievably high. 75% is not, so I had 22 children, and 6 are now living is a not at all unusual answer. I can assume that many of those children died in infancy because planters talk about it as a problem, very high infant mortality. Walter Johnson talks about this in River of Dark Dreams, very high mortality. But how many, I'm not going to be able to quantify that. But the census data is very helpful in trying to figure out how many women were born. So I think that it doesn't look anything like a family we're used to, because if the oldest son is 44 and the youngest is 6, right, then you've got what you have by that point is multiple households, and it's extended kinship networks. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering about, so there's this sense of pride in the American multiplication table. What was women's reaction to that? Was there any sort of public reaction to that, or did they share the pride? And could there also be a sense of fear of like what happens if we don't get the land, or like kind of a threat towards that?
It's a really good question. I haven't found very many women at all who said hurrah for the American multiplication table. Most of those women who are publicly, who I can hear their voices publicly, are women who have chosen to have many fewer children, who are from the Northeast, who are educated. Education has a huge piece to do with this, and are saying, oh dear, this is not good for women. Right? I think later in the century that I think that the number of children you have is one of the markers of class. It's one of the ways in which a working class and a middle class get constructed in the United States. Working class women become stigmatized for having large numbers of children. Middle class women become stigmatized for not having a lot. So damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Middle class women are accused of being frivolous and not maternal and subject to the whims of fashion, and they're curtailing their children like they curtail their grocery bills. And where are those great old families of yesteryear? And why aren't women choosing to have more children? And I think also the men are not choosing to have more children, but nobody says that. They say it's the women who are choosing not to have more children, right? And that's an interesting conversation as well. But again, it's men speaking about that predominantly. Women's public discourse about this is almost always about the burdens of childbearing. And I'm sort of trying to dig into the county histories now and the local records to see if I can find more. Most of these women didn't leave much of a record. I'm pretty sure John wrote the petition and Robert Walker, not Nancy. I don't know what Nancy thought. I'll never know what she thought. So, yes?
I'm a student of Quaker history and culture, among many other things. And then more largely, you figure out the relationship of belief systems and religion and ethnic heritage. You know, what's in your, how much you like your ancestors and when you change. And are you familiar with Jerry Frost's book on, I think, Quakers in Colonial America?
A little bit, yes.
Yeah.
And on the Quaker patterns, which are quite distinctive,
Yeah,
right?
you recognize it by the book patterns over generations.
Yeah, and the Quakers are one of the lead groups making the change to demographic transition. And there are Quakers in Pennsylvania, there's a study of Quakers in Pennsylvania saying that they say, okay, we have X amount of land. What's the reasonable amount of land for each of the children to inherit? Okay, you 3 children are not going to marry, right? Because we have enough land for 5, and there's 8 of you, so 3 children in this family are not going to marry in order to prevent the land from getting broken up into smaller and smaller pieces, right? So there's a whole bunch of beliefs are very different.
From marrying out of meeting.
Yeah.
Like Daniel Boone's family or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, Daniel Boone had 68 grandchildren.
Yeah.
Being a Quaker and so all these things. But you say, what are your real values, beliefs, and how much is it in your bones? You look at your ancestors in Wales or wherever, and they were thinking similarly.
Really interesting question. There is a demographer, and I don't do demography. I'm borrowing from the demographers, but I'm definitely not a demographer. But David Hacker has said he's tried to correlate family size with names, children's names, and he argues that those families that give children biblical names consistently are larger, whereas families that choose non-biblical names for the children tend to be smaller. On the other hand, I see some of the lead cutting-edge people in the demographic transition as being evangelicals, who are abolitionists and who are women's rights advocates and who are profoundly religious and are driven into politics by religious beliefs. And they are saying, let's have 3, right? So I'm not sure. I'm not entirely persuaded that religion in an easy way is kind of a marker of how people make decisions. But
You can find high correlations when you ask the right questions, and we don't ask those questions, we'll do something else.
yeah, there's a lot of things. There's a really, really fascinating book that I read last summer about called Quiverful, about the Quiverful movement now, which is an evangelical movement to have, well, this is from the passage in Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah, a quiver full of, a large, many children is like a quiver full of arrows, right? And encouraging women to have large numbers of children and holding them up as a model of the family. And that's explicitly religious, right? That's explicitly driven by religious beliefs and values. So
How much does it change over the generations, and how much is it, you know, you're from Sicily, you're going to have 10 children, you'll be on the Supreme Court because it's in your bones of how to God's laws or something.
it's interesting. You know, there's a great book that I really thoroughly enjoyed looking at on the demographic transition in Sicily. And it's a great study in which he says that when people decide to have fewer children, it's all through informal networks and things like that. And they document it in Sicily. Withdrawal, which men in Sicily call reverse gear. The women call it, in a much more religious way, making a sacrifice. The men call it reverse gear. In the mid-20th century, all of a sudden, everybody in Sicily decides smaller family size is a good, you know, is a positive good, and it's clearly through sort of informal networks, water cooler conversations that people pass on. You have 3 kids. How'd you do that, right? And
They stopped coming to America, or the 1920 whatever laws said they can't come to America anymore.
well, you were asking about what people have in their heads is, you know, depends on when your family came over from Sicily, what memory you may have of life in Sicily. But anyway, I found that was a fascinating study about how in the modern times things have changed. Is there time for one more question, or should we stop? I'd be happy to chat with people a little afterwards too if people can stay. Should we end?
Thank you for that just incredible presentation.
My pleasure.
And sharing your research, and please promise to come back when your book's complete.
I will be glad to. I will know a lot more then, I hope. I hope. So thank you so much again. Thank you for some really thoughtful questions and ideas, and I'd be glad to stay in touch.